Hello, folks. Today we're going to be talking about one of my very favorite short story writers, Donald Barthelme. He was writing in the 70s and 80s and died too young in 1989. But he's well known as being a surrealist, absurdist, postmodern author. And you've probably been noticing at this point in the semester that our readings are getting a little bit weirder. I like to start my students off with traditional, realist, fairly straightforward narratives, and then coax you guys toward the weirder and more experimental pieces. And we'll get weirder next class as well. But Bartholomew will mark a really important progression for us. When we're reading Bartholomew, you have to read him different than you read Mary Hood or Stuart Dybek. Absolutely. And I'd suggest to you to keep in mind the Surrealist, which we're looking at here, probably one of the, or probably the most famous Surrealist painting by Salvador Dali, The Persistence of Memory. So, those melting clocks that are all over pop culture. And Dali is a wonderful surrealist and a great representation of the movement. He's working in the 1920s and 30s, so I think Donald Barthelme will be responding to this, 40, 50 years later with what he does. But think about, what the surrealists attempted to do. They're trying to dip into the subconscious, into the dreamscape of our minds, into collective unconscious kind of ideas. So they're not their goals are not the same as a portrait artist, a realist portrait artist, for example. Dali's trying to show you a different way to perceive common everyday objects. Take a clock and make it melt. The juxtapositions are where the surrealists get a lot of their energy. When you're looking at a Dali, you're not necessarily suspending your disbelief in the same way that you would looking at a Rembrandt or something like that. He's not trying to convince you this is reality. He's in fact trying to show you a dream. Think about how Bartholomew is accomplishing that as well. He's not trying to convince you that these things would actually happen at the school. In fact, just the opposite. He's trying to make you aware that you're taking part in reading. So some other surrealists, a favorite of mine is Rene Magritte. He was in this movement as well, and there's a whole group of surrealists that are delightful fun to look at. Andre Breton was kind of one of their ringleaders. He wrote their manifesto. And Rene Magritte paints kind of similar to Dali in a fairly realist style, but again, note the juxtapositions. So what do you expect to see in a portrait painting? Somebody's face, right? Like that Mona Lisa. That should be the main focus. And Magritte has confronted you by, obstructing the view of the very thing you expect to be looking at. The lovers here is a great example too. You're not seeing the thing you'd expect to see in a portrait of two lovers. And again, so the juxtapositions are where we get this surreal version of our world. And note, in surrealism, there's a basis of realism, and like with Bartholomew too, he's basing things on the reality we know, and then shifting and escalating and juxtaposing until we get to somewhere different. Another two more of my favorite surrealists, Yves, Tanguy, and Kay Sage. Again, they paint kind of like Dali style, traditional realist, but Yves Tanguy, who's over on the left here, paints these amorphous blob shapes and these sharp kind of monoliths, and in the background is like this seascape. So you get like a sense of reality, but it's anything but. It's not quite abstraction though necessarily. Kay Sage was his wife, or I should say that Yves Tanguy was Kay Sage's husband. And they were a great pair of surrealists who supposedly fell in love with each other from just looking at each other's paintings before they knew each other's gender or anything or age or anything about each other. They just knew that they'd be together forever from looking at each other's art in different exhibits. Isn't that a wonderful love story? It ends kind of sadly, but you can look that up if you want. And by the way, there's a wonderful Kay Sage painting at the Mint Museum that I'd highly recommend looking at. So I'm giving you these surrealists again to get your mind in tune with what Barthelme is attempting to do and to provide you with an idea for a different way that you might approach writing story. Not to necessarily capture verisimilitude, to represent reality accurately, perfectly, but instead to create a work of art that is art itself. And here, maybe the best introduction for Barthelme is this Rene Magritte painting, where it says in French down at the bottom, "This is not a pipe." So, he's painting a pipe in a realist way. There's all the symbol you expect. We know what this thing is, but he's reminding you this is not a pipe. This is paint, oil paint on canvas, and you're in a gallery looking at this 2D representation of a 3D actual object. It's not a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe. So think about Barthelme that way too. He wants to like shake you out of your reading experience to instead show you art, to let you participate in the act of art. And he's a postmodernist too. We'll talk about that a little bit more next class, the postmodernist movement, that we're all about getting the reader to be aware of their experience. So, okay, onward into talking about the school, and we'll come to our good friend George Saunders, who's going to help us with his essay, The Perfect Gerbil, understand what's so great about the school, and especially about its ending. And he begins his essay referencing Freytag's pyramid, which we looked at, early on in the semester, the old rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, which is, a fairly traditional way to write a story. But that's not what Barthelme is going to give us. Again, he's going to give us anything but our expectations of what we should be finding in narrative. So I'm going to read a little bit from this essay, and then I'll blab a little bit more. So this is George Saunders, part of the way through the essay, and he notes, "So part of the fun of the school is going to be the gradual unveiling of a series of things that die. But then, immediately, writing short stories is very hard work. Barthelme is in trouble. The reader is already here at the beginning of paragraph 4, suddenly ready to be bored. The reader knows the pattern and is suddenly wary that the pattern may turn out to be all there is. If I say, I eat a small candy, then a bigger candy, then a candy the size of a room, then a candy the size of Montana, you get the idea. You know where I'm headed. There's a certain pleasure in this. You're in on the joke. Your mind knows the general shape of the fun to be expected. But if I just keep going, I eat a candy the size of the United States, the size of North America, the size of... Even typing this is getting tiresome. You are going to start to dislike me. Why? Because I'm condescending. I'm assuming that this simple linear pattern is enough to interest you. I'm treating you like a dumb beast, endlessly fascinated by a swinging weight on a cord." Saunders and Barthelme both are suggesting to us that we can't dumb down things for our reader, and our readers expect more and want more than simply the pattern to follow itself. So he has some subtitles throughout this essay, and one of them is ending is stopping without sucking. So if you're wondering how to write a great ending, which is one of the most difficult things to do, there you go. George Saunders has broken down how you accomplish it. Don't suck. Easy enough, right? So he goes on to say, all along, a question has been rising for us when we're reading the school. Okay, we've been feeling this is funny, this is enjoyable, but how and when is it going to start being literature? How is he going to take this Marx Brothers quality romp and convert it at the last minute into a postmodernist masterpiece? How, in other words, is this story going to mean? The land of the short story is a brutal land, a land very similar in its strictness to the land of the joke. When I tell a joke, everyone hearing knows that the joke is going to culminate in a punchline. And the intention of the punchline is to make them laugh. If it doesn't, the joke is dumb, and I'm a dork. Likewise, when a person presumes to tell a literary short story, everyone reading knows that it is going to culminate in an ending, and that the intention of the ending is to, well, hold on. is the intention of the ending? Or the million-dollar question for any of us who has ever tried to complete a short story, when constitutes a sufficient ending? In other words, what does Bartholomew have to do here as he goes forth from the end of paragraph 9, which I consider the end of rising action, so that we will continue to love him? His first responsibility is to not do something that will make us groan. What will make us groan? Something that too neatly answers to his pattern. Say he ended it. Then I came in one day and all the kids were dead, and all of a sudden I wasn't feeling so good myself. That was one bad semester. The end. This is not a story ending, but the ending of a lousy after-dinner speech. It knows its own pattern too well and has stuck with it mindlessly to the bitter end. It has done merely what it set out to do, and we require more of our endings than this. So, this note about patterns, I think, is really important, whether you're writing realism or something surreal or fantasy or horror or whatever. You can't simply neatly answer the pattern. For more on this, we have some quotes from Einstein and Gerald Stern, and to warn you, I'm going to swear, but it's to quote a very important concept essential for every writer to consider. George Saunders is quoting now. Einstein once said something along the lines of, "No worthy problem is ever solved within the plane of its original conception." Touching on the same idea, a famous poet, it's Gerald Stern, once said, "If you set out to write a poem about two dogs fucking, and you write a poem about two dogs fucking, then you've written a poem about two dogs fucking." What we want our ending to do is to do more than we could have dreamed it would do. Sheesh. No wonder there's such a thing as writer's block. So he's making a really important point about these quotes, and I'll just note, like, these two are basically saying the exact same thing, so take your pick if you want to remember Einstein and sound like a smarty, or Gerald Stern, who's actually quite a brilliant writer too, who maybe gives it to us a little more honestly. But we must set out to do more, is the point Saunders is making here, and a very good point at that. That will open up maybe how we think about ending our stories. So Saunders gets into the ending a bit more, the possibilities for how this thing could finish, and how it goes beyond what we might expect. So he talks about the weird kids that start talking like little philosophers, and maybe he could have ended it that way and just continued on with that language. But he decides not to do that. So Saunders says, what's happening here, I think, is that Bartholomew's mind has gotten tired of being polite. Without worrying about whether it's allowed or will be understood or is logical within the world of the story, or whether the workshop will tolerate it, he races off in the direction his logic is taking him. Appropriate diction be damned, trying to get the story to answer the question the thing's been asking all along. What are we to make of death? How are we to live in a world where death is king? We follow because we find his courage thrilling. So he could have ended with the kids, and then it turns into a love story, and he could have ended it there as well. And all of those things would have gone beyond the original plane of conception in a really interesting way. But Saunders then talks about how he doesn't even take this easy route with things. So we're back to Saunders, and this is the end of the essay. We have one long paragraph left. And look what's happened. Suddenly, Bartholomew can end this thing any way he pleases. The essential work has been done. If the narrator begins making love to Helen, that's good. If he declines, also good. The air is charged with meaning. It is everywhere we look. It seems he's going to pass. He kisses Helen on the brow, but we sense that he and Helen may soon be demonstrating some lovemaking, if only to one another, possibly in Helen's sparse apartment. Everything has changed between them. Suddenly there's death in the room, but also life and love. The reader is satisfied. So much has happened in so short a time and in such an unexpected way. It could end with a simple line. I looked at Helen, and then she looked at me. right? That's like the Hemingway ending, right? That's not bad. That would be a good ending. But Bartholomew, being great, abides long enough to produce from his sleeve one last escalation, which Bartholomew, being Bartholomew, arrives in the person of a gerbil. Where does the gerbil come from? How did it find the classroom? And why is it a gerbil and not, if we are seeking circularity, an orange tree or at least a snake? How did it knock on the door? Doesn't it know this is exactly the wrong class, that soon it will die? Or who could say, maybe Helen's just revealed love for the narrator's love has changed everything and the gerbil will live and prosper and get fat enough to overflow its cage. It is ambiguous, and it is funny, and somehow perfect. This little expectant rodent politely waiting for its knock to be answered, all set to die or to live. We, like the children, cheer wildly. So, some final thoughts from Saunders on why this story is so effective. And maybe Bartholomew is not exactly for you, but if you found any enjoyment out of it, you could certainly take the pleasure in the voice and the style that's so fantastically accomplished with Donald Bartholomew. But better, I suggest to take this overall concept of how he pushes beyond the pattern. He creates a certain expectation where he blows this up multiple times. And note, I would like to note, this is not a twist ending. He takes us to unexpected places, although I would argue everywhere he goes responds to the story. As Saunders says, what are we to make of death? To live in a world where death is king. That's been the story from the very beginning. And that's the story, when the kids are talking like little philosophers. That's the story when him and Helen are gazing lovingly at each other. And that's the story when the gerbil shows up at the door. So thematically, it's perfectly unified. It's not, it wakes up and it was all a dream. It's not the gerbil shows up with a gun and like shoots everybody, some kind of Deus ex machina ending. Instead, it's responding to its themes, but it goes beyond the original plane of conception. And that's why Saunders, and I would say, it's the perfect gerbil and one of the most perfect surrealist postmodern stories that one can find. And I'd say, again, you can apply this concept and should apply this concept to any story you're writing. Make sure you go beyond the original plane of conception, beyond the original pattern.